Hey guys, so today we'll be solving May-June 2018 A2 MCQs, so paper 3, variant 1. And as always, I'll try to go a little slow and explain every single option in an MCQ. But if you think that's a little too slow or too basic for you, feel free to speed up the video on YouTube while watching it. Okay, so let's start. So a government makes a study of the costs and benefits of allowing a leisure company to develop a holiday resort in an area of natural beauty. Now, when a government makes a study as opposed to a private firm, it does what's called a cost benefit analysis, at least in our syllabus, where it's looking at the social benefit and the social cost. This is as opposed to a private, like a private company, which would only care about its private benefit and private cost, but the government cares about social benefits and social costs. So it factors in externalities. So when should the government allow this development to take place? And a development is beneficial if the social benefit is greater than the social cost, such that the net social benefit would then be positive. So if social benefits exceed social costs, that is overall beneficial for the society, and thus the government would allow it. So one part C. What is an example of market failure? And before we look at some of the options, I just want to emphasize that market failure, especially in our syllabus, is largely, there are multiple things, but most of the MCQs you're going to get are going to be the inability of the market to take into account positive or negative externalities. So external benefits and external costs, since it's only going to look at private benefits and private costs, not social benefits and social costs, which include externalities. So that's usually what the answers will be based upon, and that can help weed out some of the other answers. So A says atmospheric pollution in cities due to emissions from cars, which is correct because the market won't take into account atmospheric pollution. That's a third-party cost, so an external cost or a negative externality due to the emission of cars. So it simply won't look at the pollution levels, and the market won't account for that, and thus the market has failed to allocate or to take into account these important externalities. So that's an example of a very textbook example of market failure. Free entry for children to an art gallery, well, if it's a private art gallery and it allows free entry for children, that's just a private cost of the gallery. It's not really, and there's no externality to it. If the government allows, if it's a government art gallery, well, then it's not really the market working in the first place, so you don't have to worry about that. High rents for housing occupied by low income households. Now, again, this seemingly seems like something that intuitively one might say is unfair because it's high rent for like poorer individuals, and it is unfair. However, it's not what we in this A-level syllabus classify as market failure, because the concept of externalities would not apply here. Like it's higher private costs for the low-income households, and it's probably not the correct thing. But that's not the like markets failing because the concept of externalities is not applying here. So you can also cross that out on that logic. Though you might think intuitively that's probably not a good thing, it doesn't mean it's an example of market failure for the like purposes of the A-level syllabus. And the inability of some football supporters to afford tickets to watch games. I mean, whether you think that's bad or good, it doesn't take into account externalities for the same reason, and thus it's not your answer. Question 3 says that the diagram shows a firm's long-run cost and revenue curves. At which level of output is the firm both allocatively efficient? Allocative efficiency is when price is equals to marginal cost, and productively efficient. Productively efficient is when you have minimum average cost. So price is equals to marginal cost. Let's look at that. You should know that your average revenue curve is the same as your price curve or your demand curve, simply because any output, the average revenue curve tells you the price. So this is your average revenue or demand curve. This is your marginal revenue curve. Another simple logic for that is total revenue is price into quantity. Average revenue is total revenue divided by quantity, the average of it. So that's just price into quantity divided by quantity, which is price. Also proves to you, if you weren't clear already, why average revenue is the same thing as price. So in this, we can just rewrite this as average revenue is equals to marginal cost. That might make it easier. In this case, your long run marginal cost. So your long run marginal cost curve intersects the average revenue curve here, and the output for that is C. So your output is origin to C, so OC. So your answer would be 3C. Now, some of you might be wondering, but wait a second, how is this productively efficient? Because you said minimum AC, shouldn't that point be somewhere on the minimum, something like here or something? And the answer is not really, because this is minimum of your short run average cost curve. This is your long run average cost curve. And all points on your long run average cost curve are productively efficient. The logic for this simply is because your long run average cost curve is made up of like short run average cost curves for every point, like the minimum of short run average cost curves for every point. So each point essentially is the minimum for your short run average cost curve. So any point on your long run average cost curve is productively efficient. So then thus this output would lead you to this LRAC, and that's also productively efficient. So actually this tells you nothing, since literally that can be any point. So only this tells you what's going on. Question 4: when does the slope, like the gradient of a budget line, always change? So we have to be certain about this. It's always. A person buys more of one of the two goods. Now, if you buy more of one of the two goods, that's simply where your optimal point is. So that's where the intersection of your budget line and the indifference curve is. That's not a change or a shift in the budget line. That's simply where you are positioned. So, or if you choose to buy more, that would then simply just be you moving along the budget line, not the slope of it changing. A person's income shifts the budget line outwards. So if prices of the goods remain the same, your budget line would simply like shift outwards if it's an increase in income, or shift inwards if it's a decrease in income. So that won't affect the slope. That preserves the slope. It's a parallel shift. One of the two goods becomes more desirable. Like the same logic applies here. If one of the two goods becomes more desirable, you might associate a higher level of utility to it, but that will affect the slope of your indifference curve, which will pivot or in a way just to show that one good gives you higher utility than the other. But that's utility. That's linked to indifference curves. We're asked about budget lines, which are basically looking at the prices of goods. You should also know that the slope of a budget line is minus price of good X upon price of good Y. So clearly the slope of the budget line is dependent on prices, and thus D makes sense for that reason, because the price of one of the two goods changes. So if any one of this would change, the overall fraction would change, and this is the slope. This is the slope. Oh, shouldn't have crossed that. It's 4D because that is the one that's correct. Question 5. The points in the diagram represent different combinations of good X and good Y. So you have good X on the Y-axis actually, and good Y on the X-axis. Weirdly so, but whatever. An individual prefers more of both goods to fewer. So more of both is better than fewer, but would prefer not to give up even a single unit of X to obtain additional units of Y. So if the comparison is between, let's say, 100 units of X, and they say, so it's 100X, and someone says, well, hey, let's have 99X, and you can get, I don't know, a million Y as well, you would still prefer this. That's what it said. You would not prefer to give up a single unit of X to obtain additional units, no matter how many those units are of Y, which means that the priority for you is to maximize X, because one X is more valuable than no matter how much Y. So based on that, the first thing we should be looking at is where is good X maximized, because that is the priority, the strict priority for the consumer. Again, just don't look at the X-axis here, because good X is on the Y-axis. I don't know why they've done that, just to mess with our heads a bit. So clearly N has the highest level of good X. So we're not even going to look at good Y, because good X is the most important thing. And like you don't even care about if you have more Y. Here, like for example, M has more Y, but it has more Y, but it has less X, and that's all you care about. If it has less X, you don't care. you do not prefer to give up a single unit of x for additional units of y. So the first in priority, it's a descending order, so the highest to lowest. First in priority is point n. When you can come to L and M, if you notice x, the amount of good x is the same, but L has less y, M has more y. And it did say it would prefer more of both goods than to fewer. So thus M would be better than L because the x is the same, but at least in M you have higher units of y. So that's better. And then L has high x but less y compared to M. And notice K has more y compared to L, but that doesn't matter because x is the strict priority. So L will still take it over K, which leaves K as the final option. N, M, L, K. Okay, that's option D. The diagram shows the firm's total cost curve. At which level of output will the firm's marginal cost, will the firm's marginal cost be equals to its average cost? You should know for a total cost curve, the gradient or the slope of a total cost curve is your marginal cost. Why? Because you have quantity on the x-axis, so the gradient essentially tells you if you increase quantity by 1 unit, how much does total cost increase, which is the definition of marginal cost, like the additional cost of producing 1 unit. So the gradient of a total cost curve shows us the marginal cost. They have given us some values for average cost. Let me just use a different color to highlight this. So the values for average costs are essentially, if you remember, average cost is just total cost divided by quantity. So that's what they're doing. This is showing a value of average cost because it's just total cost here divided by quantity A. This is also showing a value of average cost. This is as well because at different points they've just taken total cost and divided by quantity. So we need to see at which level of output will the firm's marginal cost, its gradient, be equals to its average cost, which are these lines. And when the gradient is the same as a line, is essentially when the line is tangent to the curve. So here the marginal cost, the gradient, is the same as this line, which is the average cost, giving you C. Now, this explanation might have been too mathy. Another way to look at it, which is explained in the marking in the examiner report, this was one of the questions which most people got wrong, so it was a tricky question. In the examiner report, another way to look at it is that the marginal cost curve intersects the average cost when at minimum average cost. So this is something you should know. If this is average cost, then your marginal cost would be below your average cost when the average cost is decreasing, and your marginal cost curve would be above your average cost curve when your average cost curve is increasing, which means that it intersects the average cost curve at minimum average cost. The logic for this is it's below the average cost curve when the average cost is decreasing, because if it's below it, that will pull it down. And it is above the average cost curve when the average cost is increasing, because it's above the average cost, so it will pull it up. And that means if this was decreasing, this was increasing, so this should be the minimum, the turning point. And that's just something that you're also taught in theory. So essentially, marginal cost curve intersects average cost. It's equals to average cost at minimum average cost. So this is the second way to look at it. Since you know this already, you've been given the average cost at different points. So this is the average cost for point A, and this is the average cost for point D, and then so on and so forth. The minimum average cost, i.e. the flattest line, is point C. So since this is the minimum average cost, this should be where the marginal cost curve intersects it, because marginal cost intersects average cost at minimum average cost. So that's another way of explaining it that you can use to make sense of the question. If it's still unclear, feel free to comment below, and I'll try to explain it in a little more detail. It was a question that did cause some trouble with most people attempting the exam in 2018. What is necessary for a firm to practice price discrimination, the process of charging different prices to different consumers for the same service? And what you should know is that markets have to be separated. Why? Because if there are separated markets, then you can charge a different price in one market and a different price in another market. So if like Pakistan and India have separated markets for the same product, you could be charging maybe a higher price in India and a lower price in Pakistan, for example. That's price discrimination. But if the markets aren't separated, if they're just like quite easily, you can go from one market to the next. So let's say in one district of a same city, you're charging, yeah, that's one market. In another district of the same city, it's another market. There, practicing price discrimination won't really work because people can observe it more clearly, and people can just switch to the market in which you have a lower price, or just buy from there. So essentially, which means you can't. It's not as easy to practice price discrimination effectively. Many buyers in the market doesn't really help. Like there could be many buyers, but that doesn't mean you can discriminate against them. Many firms actually hurts you because that's just more competition, makes it harder to do weird things like discriminate price. And the price elasticity of the demand of the product is inelastic, can help you exploit the customer. Doesn't necessarily mean that you will be able to have price discrimination and charge different prices from different customers, which you can even charge for elastic goods. So that's not necessarily a necessary condition. A mobile cell telephone manufacturing company takes over an electronic chip design company, and they're asking what example of growth is it. So this is an example of vertical growth in the backwards direction. So let's first see why it's vertical. It's because an electronic chip design company is more of your raw material, is part of a lateral production process, so that these guys, they design electronic chips. These chips go to the telephone manufacturing company, and it uses the chips to produce telephones. So that's what a vertical merger essentially is. The reason why it's backwards is because you are going back to the source, back to the raw material, like back to previous stages in the production cycle. So you're going from a telephone manufacturing company, which is like still closer to the final product, to something which is closer to the raw material, or closer, or like further from the final product. So electronic chip design company. So that's why it's vertical backwards instead of forwards. An imperfectly comparative firm, so an imperfectly comparative firm, was making supernormal profits, where your average revenue is greater than average cost. The following year, it made normal profit, where your average revenue is equals to average cost, but no change in output. And how can you show this on a diagram? By a movement to the left of the average revenue curve. In fact, before this, let me just quickly draw a diagram for monopolistic competition, which is probably what they're referring to. Price, quantity. So you have your demand curve, which is also called your average revenue curve. You have your marginal revenue curve. You have your marginal cost. This is probably what you're producing at MC is equals to MR. And since you are making supernormal profits, um, because you are making supernormal profits, your average revenue should be above your average cost. So let's say it's something like this. So that's your supernormal profits. Now, they're saying option A says by a movement to the left of the average revenue curve. A movement to the left would do one crucial thing. It would change your output. And it says no change in output. So you can just cross it out. A movement to the right of the marginal revenue curve, if you move here, it would change the point. Um, if you move on your marginal revenue curve, you're also, by the same logic, changing your output. So that's also something you can cross out. By a shift to the right of the marginal cost curve. If the marginal cost curve, this is getting a little messy, but if it shifts to the right, it will intersect the marginal revenue curve at a different point. So it will also still change your output. So all of these things change your output, and thus they can't be the correct option because it says no change in output. So by elimination, you have by an upward shift in the average cost curve. And the reason why this makes sense is because if you simply have an upward shift of the average cost curve, this would ensure that average cost is equals to average revenue, taking it at the same level of output to normal profits. The diagram got a little messy, but it's just for additional explanation. The logic is something you can understand just verbally as well. What is implied by an observation that an industry is contestable? Now, the idea behind contestable industries is that there are low barriers to entry. So there's a possibility, or it is possible that new firms can enter the market. This is different from competitive industries. In competitive industries, it's not just about the possibility. In reality, new firms have entered the market, and there are many firms in the market. A contestable industry is a little more broad than that, and it's like irrespective of the number of firms in the market, it could even be a monopoly in the market. But that's not the point. The point is whether barriers to entry are low and potentially new firms could enter the market. So there's a threat of new entry, of new competition. And that means that monopoly power is not necessarily exploited. Why so? Because even if though you're a monopoly, if the industry is contestable, there's the threat that new entrants might come in. So if you start hiking up prices and making supernormal profits, new entrants will come in. So while if it's a monopoly, it's not necessarily a competitive industry. But if there are low barriers to entry, it's still a contestable industry. So even if there's a monopoly, it won't exploit its power because it knows that its monopoly power isn't for granted. New entrants can easily come in because there are low barriers to entry. Barriers to entry make little difference to a firm's monopoly power. No, barriers to entry are extremely important here because low barriers to entry mean that uh, new firms can enter and threaten the monopoly's power. Firms in the industry can earn abnormal profits in the long run. Well, if the industry remains contestable, they can't, because contestability implies low barriers to entry, irrespective of the timeline. Inefficient firms can survive in the industry in the long run. Same logic applies. Inefficient firms can't survive because if you're inefficient, there are low barriers to entry, and new entrants can come in and knock you out. So contestable industries are quite similar to comparative industries, where the threat is enough for the industry to act like a comparative industry, like close to a perfectly comparative industry. What is likely to facilitate the growth of large firms in an economy? An industry structure which approximates to perfect competition. What you should know in perfect competition, there are lots of firms. So lots and lots of firms all producing. So there's lots of competition. So large firms can't really grow because they have so much competition by like thousands of firms. So that doesn't facilitate growth. Dividend payments. So the payments you make to your shareholders, because they've bought shares, they bought stock in your company. So the payments you make to them are a low proportion of company profits. So this basically means that out of your total company profits, a very small percentage has to be given as dividend payments. This could be it. I'm just going to put a slight uh, line here just to keep that option open, because if dividend payments are a low proportion, a low percentage of your company profits, that means most of the company's profits can be injected back or invested back into the firm to allow it to grow, to allow it to become better, to allow it to develop, to do more R&D. So that is the key recipe to growing a firm. So that helps a lot. So it's probably B, but let's look at the other options. Government regulations prevent takeovers. If they prevent takeovers, you can't merge with other firms, acquire other firms. So you're unlikely to grow, because a very important aspect of growth is acquiring other firms to become very, very large. The existence of managerial diseconomies of scale. So diseconomies of scale are where once you increase output, your average cost actually increases. So that's opposed to economies of scale. So when you have diseconomies of scale, we don't even need to look at what managerial is. But when you have diseconomies of scale, that discourages you from growing too much, because the more you grow, the more average cost you have. So this is wrong because it discourages you from growing, not encourages you from growing. Managerial diseconomies of scale are just like communication, and managing such a big firm is very hard. So that's what they're referring to. So if you have larger firms and if they're very difficult to manage, it's difficult to manage all the workers there. That's called managerial diseconomies of scale, because the larger you get, the more managerial cost, management cost, HR cost you will suffer. A firm changes its objective from maximizing profit. Uh, Maximizing profit is where you produce at marginal cost is equals to marginal revenue, to producing at the allocatively efficient output. This is where you price at marginal cost. Marginal price can also be is the same thing as average revenue as well. So you go from here, you're going from here to here. In which market structure must the firm operate for this to cause the least change in economic welfare? Now, this is perfect competition, and if you know the diagram, you can understand why I knew that right off the bat. Let me just quickly draw it. So in perfect competition, because there are so many producers, you have a perfectly elastic demand curve. Demand is also equals to AR, which is equals to price. But in this case, since the demand curve is flat, this is also equals to MR, marginal revenue. Why? Because if you increase quantity by 1 unit, the revenue only increases by the amount of price, because the price is remaining fixed throughout. Anyhow, let's just rub this real quick. So you will also have a marginal cost curve. And as he mentioned, this is what you'll be producing for maximizing profit. So marginal cost is equals to marginal revenue. Marginal cost is equal to marginal revenue. So you're producing quantity Q. And if this is the case, now you're going to equate average cost to marginal cost. So average revenue to marginal cost, or you're going to equate price to marginal cost. But average revenue is also this, so this will still remain the same. So in perfect competition, it's not even the least change in economic welfare, it's like literally the same thing, nothing changes. So it's like zero change. Which government policy is intended to correct market failure? Again, going back to what we were emphasizing on earlier, market failure is talking about missing out or not looking at positive or negative externalities. So keep that in mind. Guaranteed minimum prices for farmers producing certain agricultural products. Now, guaranteed minimum prices for farmers is a good thing. It can help their income, but there's no externality here directly that the minimum price is doing. All it's doing is ensuring that farmers have livable incomes in most cases. You can still make an argument out of this, but in the most direct sense of this is not a government policy intended to correct market failure. It's a government policy usually done just for humanitarian purposes to ensure farmers have access to adequate amount of wage. Imposition of taxes on factories releasing pollutants into rivers. So taxes on factories releasing pollutants will increase the cost of factories, discourage them from releasing pollutants, and will make them pay for it. Again, releasing pollutants into rivers is a negative externality. It's an external cost, and that is an example of market failure because the market would not care about this. The market would not look into this. The market would not factor in the external cost. So this is a government policy intended to correct market failure. Rent controls, the same logic as the question about we did previously. While it's good to have rent controls for low-income individuals, it's not. There's no externality here, so this doesn't fall under the ambit of market failure. And same, this is a good humanitarian move, but again, the externality is not so relevant here as opposed to in point B, so it's not an example of market failure as well. The chart shows changes in employment by sector for a country between 2010 and 2016. So in this time period, it's showing changes in employment. But there are percentage changes, so let's be careful about that. Which statement about the spirit must be correct for this country? Employment in the service industries increased. So what are your service industries? Your service industries is your tertiary sector. So primary sector is stuff like agriculture, fishing, so on. Secondary sector is manufacturing, and tertiary sector are your service sector. So things like banking, doctors, people of that sort. And clearly employment here did increase because there was a 6% change in employment. So it was a plus 6%. So it does show an increase in employment by 6%. So this is correct. Let's look at the other options anyways. The primary sector lost more workers than the secondary sector. Please don't pick this. The primary sector's decrease in employment as a percentage was more than the secondary sector. But since this is a percentage, we can't make a comment about the number of workers because that's completely different. That would depend on the total number of workers in each sector. So if they had said lost more workers as a percentage, that could have been correct. But as it stands, you can't make a comment about the number of workers. There was no change in the total working population. None of this tells us that. Again, these are about percentages as a percentage in tertiary sector. So please don't say -2, -4, +6 is equals to 0 for both of these options. That's not the case because -4 is a percentage of the primary sector workers, which could be more or less than secondary sector. So you can't make that claim. Secondary sector is again -2% of the workers in the secondary sector. So we don't know how many workers there were in the secondary sector. What was the original amount of workers in the secondary sector? So we know about percentage changes, but we can't comment on whether in a numeric sense there was no change in the total working population or whether unemployment stayed constant. These are all things we can't comment on because we don't know, we only know percentages. We don't know total amounts or like how many people worked there in the first place. So we can't comment on numeric values. An engineer is paid 100,000 a year. The next paid job she could get as a teacher is 60,000 a year. What are her transfer earnings, and economic rent? So what you should know, transfer earnings are the minimum amount that an employee is willing to accept in a job before they can leave the industry, and it's usually the opportunity cost of working there. And the opportunity cost of working there is the 60,000 a year job otherwise that she could get. So in this case, your transfer earnings are 60,000 because that's the minimum. Like she's fine being an engineer if it's 60,000 or more, but if it goes less than 60,000, then she'd just be a teacher instead. Economic rent is all of that above. So you're earning 10K, sorry, 100K. That's your wage, and your transfer payments, or earnings, sorry, not transfer payments, I don't know why I'm saying that, transfer earnings are 60K. So the additional amount you're earning above your transfer earnings is 40K, and that's your economic rent. So these two get this. All right, let's go to question 16 rather. Okay, so in question 16, what will necessarily cause the supply curve of labor in a particular industry to shift towards the right? So supply curves shifting towards the right means that the supply of labor has increased. So what will cause that? A fall in wages paid in similar occupations. And this is your correct answer because in similar occupations, think of these like substitutes or alternative occupations. If their wages fall there, then this industry seems more attractive to workers. So you would simply have more workers joining the industry, and that leads to your increase in supply. Excuse the very, very bad handwriting. So for example, if it's an industry of math teachers, for example, well, it's not really an industry, but as is an example, if you're talking about the supply of math teachers and wages fall for economics teachers or physics teachers, you'd probably have a greater supply for math teachers because like lots of other economics or physics teachers would end up just teaching math because their other occupations, their similar occupations, just aren't paying enough. And you can probably think of better examples than just that. A greater use of machinery won't increase the supply of labor. If anything, it'll cause a decrease probably in the demand of labor because you need less labor since you're using more machinery. You're being more capital intensive. But either way, it's a demand function, not supply. An increase in demand for the product will affect the demand of labor and increase that, but will not affect the supply of labor. It might cause a movement in the supply curve of labor as your demand curve shifts, and that is a change in the quantity supplied of labor, but it's not a shift in the supply of labor. A strengthening of trade union influence. Again, if the trade union influence in the industry changes, they might push for different minimum wage or something of that sort. But those will all lead to movements. They don't shift your supply curve. Because the reason is if they increase or decrease wage, given that it's wage upon quantity of labor, this is your supply of labor, any wage changes simply get movements across the curve. They don't shift the curve. The same way any price changes in a demand curve of a product just cause movements, don't shift the curve. A cafe owner near a beach employed 5 staff and paid them each $10 an hour during the holiday season. 2 extra staff were needed. To get extra staff, this employer had to increase the hourly rate for all staff to $12 an hour. Now, what you really should not do in this, given that they have asked the marginal cost each hour of employing the 2 extra staff, is you really should not pick this. Because you might think, oh, marginal cost. So what's the additional cost of employing these 2 extra staff units? Oh, it's 12 into 2, that's 24. Please, that's not the correct answer. And the reason is because you have to increase they increase the hourly rate of all of the staff to $12 an hour, not just the two new staff members. So there are 2 ways to do this. The first way is to look at that your marginal cost would be the cost of employing the 2 extra staff. That's 2 people for $12 an hour. So that's 12 into 2. Plus, what about your old 5 staff? You were paying them $10 an hour. Now you have to pay everyone $12 an hour. So that's 5 people multiplied by a difference of 2, because you were paying them $10. Now you have to pay them $12. So for these 5 people, you have to pay $2 extra. And this will lead to 24 plus 10, 34. So that's the first way. It's the slightly faster way. You can do it in your head as well. The second way is a little simple, where you just calculate new total cost subtracted by old total cost, and that's your marginal cost. So that's the difference in cost when hiring 2 extra staff members. So new total cost will simply be you have 2 plus your original 5, and you're paying all of them $12 an hour. So that's 7 people into 12. Your old total cost was just 5 staff members and $10 an hour. So that's 5 into 10. You should get the same answer from here as well. So whichever way resonates with you the best, you can opt for that. The diagram shows an economy's PPC. What causes a movement from point X to point Y? So here you were not using you were not employing all of your resources at point Y. You are employing all of your resources. You have become productively efficient, and you are now at full employment. A positive output gap. Well, a positive output gap would be if you went beyond Y, if you went somewhere like Z, for example, and that's a positive output gap. So you're going beyond your potential. I do want to explain this a little further, because people find positive output gaps somewhat weird to understand conceptually. Like, how can an economy go beyond its potential? And there are many ways, but one way to think about it is if in the very short period of time your factories are overloaded, so they're stuffed beyond capacity in terms of output. Everyone's producing more than your full employment output, because they're not just full employment. There's lots of people working overtime, extra hours, all of those, that sort of stuff. So that can put you beyond your potential output as well. So that can put you beyond your PPC, which indicates the output you produce at full employment. So working overtime and having all of that rampant in the economy can put you beyond the output of full employment. But that's just like a conceptual thing I want to clarify. But clearly, it would take you even further than Y. It wouldn't just take you just to Y. A recession would take you even backwards, because there's more unemployment. Now it's actual versus potential economic growth. This is actual growth because it's just employing more resources to actually grow to improve your actual point. Potential growth would just be increasing your PPC, which doesn't affect your actual point, just affects how much you can potentially produce. So you can mark that wrong there as well. In an economy, real national output increases more rapidly than the increase in employment. So your output is increasing by, let's say, 50%, but your employment is increasing by, let's say, 10%. So how does this work? Like, you just employed 10% more workers, but you're producing 50% more output. So what's happening here? These are just some random example figures, but that's what they're saying. What could account for this? A decrease in the general price level? Well, if there's a decrease in the general price level, if AD has decreased, or for whatever reason, that if anything, that might cause a decrease in output, not an increase in output and employment. But even if this comes from an increase in aggregate supply, like, that doesn't explain this odd situation. It's not explaining it in any way. Improving countries' terms of trade, so the price of your exports as a ratio of price of imports. I mean, if they improve, that's good in a way for some countries, but that doesn't explain this particular question at all, because how does that mean national output increases more than employment? An increase in labor productivity would do so, because that would mean that fewer people are producing more, which is why the real national output is increasing by more than the increase in employment, because the same number of workers are, or slightly more workers are producing lots more because their productivity has improved. So this would explain it. And the size of the labor force could increase, that's fine, but you're still, this is talking about employment rate. So out of the size of the labor force, you're still employing more, but the point is you're producing more than you're employing. So just because the size of the labor force has increased doesn't explain why you're producing more than you're employing. The table shows what has happened to 3 economic indicators between 2 years in a country. When would GDP, this is not GDP per capita, this is just GDP, have been the most accurate measure of standard of living in that country? So GDP is not really an accurate measure of standard of living, but in which case would it be the closest or the most accurate is what they're saying. So let's compare. Population could be constant or could be rising. We will go with constant, because if it's a rising population, that will mess up, because then your GDP is not a very good comparison between the before the 2 years and after the 2 years, because this is not GDP per capita, which factors in for population. So since it's not factoring in for population, population should ideally be constant. Inflation rate should be low and stable, which automatically gives you A, because you can cross this out as well, simply because GDP does not take into account inflation rate or prices either. It's not real output or real income or real GDP. So you would ideally want your prices to be like low and stable and not actually be changing a lot, so that your GDP can still an accurate measure of comparison. And income distribution should be equal, because GDP does not take into account how the income is distributed. Even GDP per capita does not do that. So if it's unequal, then GDP is not a good measure of the standard of living. This is not saying it's a good measure of the standard of living. This is just saying it's where is it most good or most accurate. What is explained in the explanation of cyclical unemployment? All right, so let's first explain what cyclical unemployment is. 1 second. Yeah, so cyclical unemployment is basically where, due to changes in aggregate demand, so or just generally output, if aggregate demand decreases, you simply have less employment. So this employment basically contingent on the shifts in output, the shifts in your GDP, the shifts in the business cycle. But why does this happen? Let's try to dig a little deeper. So when aggregate demand or GDP, any of these things, when this decreases, what simply means is that for your producers, they're making less money, so they're making less profit in a way, because things aren't selling as much. So they have to produce less because things simply aren't selling. Now they can do 2 things. They can either keep all the workers, but if they keep all the workers, they're making less, they're producing less, so the revenue is less. They have to pay them less. So you keep similar amount of workers, but you pay them less. That's one option. Your second option is you keep less workers. So you fire a few workers and you pay them a similar amount. So you pay them a same or a similar amount. Now, the assumption and what is assumed here in cyclical unemployment is the case of option 2, which is where you keep less workers, which is where the firing or the unemployment actually comes. If you kept all the workers, then there would be no firing, right? You would just pay all of them less, because you're making less as a business. Now, this is option D, that money wages, so not your real wages, just the nominal wage, are inflexible, are rigid, are sticky, are less likely to change in a downward direction. This basically means that the assumption is that it's difficult to reduce the wage of a worker because they have a certain expectation. Because if you reduce the wage, you're fearful that they might lose motivation, all of those things. Which is why instead of going for option one, which is keeping all the workers but paying them less, you don't go with this option and you go with this option. Because the idea is that since money wages are inflexible in a downward direction, you can't pay workers a lot less. It's just easier to fire some of the workers and pay them and pay the rest of them a similar amount. So if there's a recession, for example, you're probably not going to start paying your teachers like 50% or 75% of what they were earning before. You would instead just fire a few teachers and like keep the good ones and pay them the same amount, a similar amount. So because money wages are inflexible in a downward direction, i.e., it's difficult to reduce the wage, that's why you have to fire a few people rather than keeping everyone and just paying them less. So you keep some, you pay them similar amount, you fire the rest, and that's basically what contributes to cyclical unemployment. We can go through the other options for completeness sake. Employers employ more labor if aggregate demand increases. So this is just wrong. If aggregate demand decreases, you employ less labor because you're producing and making less money. Exchange rates ensure that the value of imports is always equal to the value of exports. I mean, a floating exchange rate might do that, but how is that linked to cyclical unemployment? Unsure. Interest rates make planned investment equals to planned savings. Again, that could do that, and it does often do that if it's a freely floating interest rate or a freely floating exchange rate. But if I is equals to savings, what does that have to do with like less output, or how does that explain unemployment? I've just colored over this for fun, so I probably shouldn't do that. So it doesn't explain that, and that's why these options are wrong. What identifies net injections into a country's circular flow of income? So net injections basically mean when your injections are greater than your withdrawals or your leakages, whatever you want to call it. So investment is an injection, savings is a withdrawal. So investment should be greater than savings because we are looking for net injection. So injections greater than withdrawals. This is correct. Export is a injection because you earn money that you put into the economy. Import is a withdrawal because you lose money from the economy. So export should not be less than imports. That would not be a net injection. That'd be a net withdrawal. So the two clauses are correct. Government expenditure is an injection because you're injecting money into the economy. Taxation is a withdrawal because you're taking money away from the economy to the government. So if government expenditure is less than taxation, that's bad. That's a net withdrawal. That's not a net injection because the injection is the government expenditure. So this should also be a cross because this does not help with net injections. So you're left with 22B. According to Keynes, sometimes monetary policy, so the policy of tweaking with interest rates or like increasing money supply, is ineffective. The supply of money is assumed to be controlled by the central bank. The demand of money LP is LP, and there has been an increase in the real income in an economy. In the diagram, which position makes monetary policy ineffective? Now, this is the typical what is called as the liquidity trap, which essentially happens, and I'm not going to go into great detail about this theory, but you could potentially comment below if you are interested, and I can explain it in a little more detail, or link you up to some nice pages which have very nice explanations regarding this. But the liquidity trap is essentially a situation where monetary policy is ineffective, where interest rates are so low that increasing money supply has no impact on interest rates because they're already too low. So if interest rates do not change, there's like the impact of increase in money supply, which is your monetary policy, is like zero, none, zilch. So you're looking for very low interest rates, and that gives you A. Another way to look at this is at this particular point, if you increase money supply, the interest rates remain the same. So the impact of the monetary policy is nothing, which is what they were talking about. It's ineffective. All right. 24. So the US economy, which relies heavily on international trade, so it does a lot of trade to obtain raw materials and to sell products, is in equilibrium at point X. This is point X, if the value of the US dollar falls, this is a case of depreciation. What would be the new equilibrium point? So there are two impacts to depreciation. The first one is the supply side, so or the import side. So if your dollar is less valuable, then your price of imports increases because the other currency that you'll have to pay people in. So let's example the other euros or the other yuan, which you have to pay to buy the imports in. That's just more expensive. So it's more expensive to import. And what that essentially means is if it's more expensive to import, then the cost of getting raw materials all increases. So your cost of production would increase because your raw materials are more expensive. Your costs overall increase. Your average supply decreases, which is a shift to the left. And that's also what we call cost push or inflation. In this case, has a specific term, a name which is called imported inflation, since it's linked to imports. And we do know it buys raw materials and imports them. Imports raw materials to make products because it's literally written in the question. So your aggregate supply will change. So you know that you are here. So it's either A or B at this particular point in time, depending on your impact on aggregate demand. Now, what will happen with your aggregate demand? Let's look at your exports. So exports. So the price of your exports will decrease because the dollar, which is the currency you're selling it at, selling it in rather, that's just the value has fallen. The dollar is weaker. It's depreciated. Now, when the price of your exports decrease, this usually increases your export revenue. And since AD is C plus I plus G plus X minus M, increase in export revenue just increases AD. So this would increase AD like that, and you go and you get point number, so option number B, and that's B is your answer. Now, if you're a particularly thorough student, you might be wondering, wait, doesn't this only happen when the Marshall-Lerner condition is fulfilled, i.e. when your demand for the exports is elastic, where a decrease in price leads to a greater than proportionate increase in quantity of your exports, which increases export revenue? And you'd be right. And that's an assumption that we are making and that it hasn't been given to us in the question. But the rule of thumb, which you can employ for such questions and for MCQs in general, is that where it's unclear whether the demand is elastic or inelastic, you can assume it to be elastic. Is mainly because one, it's international trade. You're selling it in the global market where there exist lots and lots and lots of substitutes. So that does usually make the demand elastic, and in the long run, it's usually elastic as well. All factors we studied in AS economics. Sorry about that. From any additional national income, 20% is spent on imports, 25% is paid in taxes, and 5% is saved. And the rest is spent on domestically produced goods. So the rest is your consumption, which is your marginal propensity to consume. This is your marginal propensity to spend on imports, like 0.2, 20%. Like the marginal rate amount that is taxed is 25. Your marginal propensity to save is 0.05, i.e. 5%. So marginal propensity to consume is the rest, which is 20 plus 25 is 45 plus 5 is 50. So what's remaining is 50%. So marginal propensity to consume is 50%, but we usually don't give MPC in percentage. We just say 0.5 because 50% is 0.5. So your MPC is something you should immediately calculate before you even proceed. According to the multiplier effect, we're glad we calculated our MPC here. If exports increase by 100 million, what will be the final increase in spending by the country's residents on domestically produced goods? So we know that MPC is 0.5, and what you should know, I'm not going to go behind the theory with this, but what you just should know for your MCQ is that the multiplier is 1 upon 1 minus MPC, which in this case is 1 upon 1 minus 0.5, which is 1 upon 0.5. You can use your calculator, which is 2. So the multiplier is 2. Now, what do? Do you simply take 100, multiply by 2, and pick option C? Well, that's what lots of people did in the exam, and the examiner report mentioned that because it's one of the tricky questions. But they all did not get a point for this question. Why? Because this is 100 million that's being injected into the economy through exports. However, we only care about the multiplier effect. We only care about the overall impact of domestically produced goods consumption. And we know that the consumption, that the amount that's spent on domestically produced goods is only 50% to begin with, right? Because 20% is spent on imports, 25% is spent on taxes, and so on. So out of 100 million, 20% is spent on imports, 25% is paid on taxes, 5% is saved. Only 50% is spent on local consumption. So out of 100 million, only 50 million is actually being spent on domestic consumption. So only 50 million would be multiplied by the multiplier to get 100, because we only care about the impact on increased spending on domestically produced goods, which is why this option would be B. So most people in this case either picked A or C. Both of them are wrong. In A, you're just looking at, 100 USD comes in, 50% is spent on local consumption, so the answer is 50 million. Forgetting there's a multiplier. Here, people who picked this multiplied, but forgot that the multiplier, while it would normally apply for all of the 100 million, but we don't care about all of the 100 million. We care about the proportion of that which is spent on local products. 50 million is being spent on local products only, and thus the multiplier should only be applied to that 50 million. So it was quite a nice question, this one. In a Keynesian model, why would a 100 million increase in government expenditure on goods and services have a greater impact on aggregate demand than a 100 million reduction in tax revenue? And the basic idea here is if you spend 100 million in government expenditure, the multiplier that's involved there is larger than the multiplier or than the impact if you reduce tax in such a way that 100 million is reduced. Now, why is that so? Consumers only spend only a part of any disposable income, of any extra disposable income. This is true because out of an extra amount of disposable income, you save some and you consume some. You could, like that could vary. You could consume 60% of the extra disposable income. You could consume 70% of the extra disposable income. But in most realistic cases, you don't consume 100% of the extra disposable income. You save some and you consume some. So this is correct. Why? Because if you have government expenditure of 100 million, that's 100 million into the economy. And then you have your multiplier and everything. But even if you don't look at your multiplier right now, just trying to understand it, it's 100 million directly into the economy. If you reduce tax such in a way that you've reduced up to 100 million of tax revenue overall, that is 100 million in the economy in terms of consumers' disposable income. But in government expenditure, the entire 100 million benefits on the multiplier. Consumers, however, if they have 100 million tax deduction, they would keep some of it in their pockets. Some of them some of it they would save in the bank, and only a certain percentage of it would they consume or would they use. So the injection into the economy is comparatively less, and this explains that. Government expenditure does not create wealth is just untrue. I mean, it builds stuff. You could build roads. You can create jobs. That creates income, can create wealth. The marginal tax rate affects the value of the multiplier. I mean, for sure it does, but that doesn't explain why 100 million tax reduction is less than government expenditure. Like, you should explain which multiplier is more or less, and that doesn't explain it. And the multiplier obviously applies to consumer expenditure. When someone consumes, that does have a multiplier effect. The point just here is that that in terms of that, like, the multiplier would just be less because you only consume a part of your extra income. Equilibrium income in the economy is the level of national income at which, so whenever you talk about equilibrium, then the reason I'm answering this first is because there you have a very nice answer here, is because equilibrium is income, or equilibrium anything, is the point at which there is no tendency to change. This is something we studied since AS O-level economics. What's equilibrium price, or the equilibrium point in your demand and supply diagram? It's a point at which there is no tendency to change. It's a point of rest. And the same logic applies here. Equilibrium income is the national income where there is no tendency to change unless you change some other exogenous, some other extra factor. So that's what point D explains, which is why it's the correct answer. Let's look at the rest anyways. This explains full employment national income. Well, that is full employment national income, but that doesn't mean while remain full employment national income forever, that could suffer from inflationary, deflationary pressures. So it doesn't explain why it's equilibrium. It's not equilibrium just because you're full employment. Inflow and outflow of currency is equal. That would help stabilize and perhaps achieve equilibrium in your exchange rate diagram, but in the demand supply of your currency. But that doesn't prove why your national income would be at equilibrium. Government expenditure is equals to government revenue means that you have a balanced budget, but that doesn't a balanced budget is very different than overall national income, so it doesn't prove or answer the question either. What is not an automatic stabilizer? Automatic stabilizers are just those that resist changes in terms of output or in terms of prices, or just generally resist changes to the economic cycle of the economy. So if aggregate demand increases, try to push up output, they would automatic stabilizers would try to resist it a bit by reducing output or reducing growth. The aggregate demand or it falls, there's a recession, they would try to stimulate growth a bit. So they just automatic, they just try to resist change and stabilize it. Now, income tax is an automatic stabilizer. When you have growth, you have higher levels of income, but then you tax that income more heavily as well, because income tax is progressive. So the higher income is taxed more heavily, which in a way tries to fight against the change, which is the higher income and higher growth. So that in a way is an automatic stabilizer. Profits tax is also same idea. So it's a tax on corporations' profits, so it also can be progressive. But even if it's proportional, when you're producing more, like you're just giving more in tax because it's the same. Even if it's the same percentage, you're just giving more amount, and thus this is just a way of trying to fight. If there's growth and corporations are making more money, more profits, it'll try to fight against it and stabilize it in a way by more money going towards tax. Similarly, if there's a recession and profits are less, it tries to boost it in a way because you go into a lower tax bracket, or even if it's the same percentage, you're just paying less tax. So in a way, these try to stabilize any change. I'm not saying they're successful in stabilizing; they're just like a minimal impact in a way to stabilize it. State retirement pension. Now, this would be true. This is not an automatic stabilizer because like the pension amount is fixed. It's usually decided beforehand depending on your nature of your job, and it's like your retirement pension after you retire. So it has nothing to do with whether production increases or production decreases. Unemployment benefit is an automatic stabilizer simply because if aggregate demand decreases, you have the number of people that are unemployed uh, increases. So in a number of people that are unemployed increases, and then thus more people enjoy the benefit. So while in a way you could say incomes are falling, but and because of that, you could make the argument that incomes are falling and that's a change, but the unemployment benefit is trying to fight that fall of income by providing the unemployed with some benefit. So it's still a minor fight against like the decrease in aggregate demand, because when you provide unemployment benefits, that's some income to people, they can try to consume a bit, try to fight back the decrease in aggregate demand. Which policy is most likely to allow a developed economy to meet all of its macroeconomic objectives? Lowering interest rates to raise actual growth above potential growth. That's great. That will meet the objective of economic growth. This is an expansionary monetary policy. But then if you're just lowering interest rates would increase aggregate demand because it encourages more people to consume as opposed to save. And that can lead to demand pull inflation. Demand pull and cost push. Demand pull inflation, so it's difficult. You don't meet the objective of low inflation. So you meet one macroeconomic objective, not all macroeconomic objectives. Supply side reform is the way to get all macroeconomic objectives, because if you increase aggregate supply, you have a lower price level, so you're improving on inflation, and you have higher output as well. So that would be B. Tax reform to make the system of taxes increasingly regressive. I mean, if you make it increasingly regressive, it's going to have a high impact on prices, because prices are going to increase. Regressive taxes are usually sales taxes, so you won't really be getting low inflation. So that's one macroeconomic objective you can't achieve. And if you introduce tariffs to protect the domestic industry, you might have growth within the domestic industry, but it's unlikely that you'll have a balanced uh, balance of payment. Or so you don't want, in your balance of trade and balance of payment, one of the objectives is you don't want them to fluctuate too much. You don't want them to have too big of a surplus, too big of a deficit. So you don't get that objective in this either, which is why like the policies which do the best of all worlds or both worlds are just supply side policies. They're just very difficult and expensive to do, which is why the question is phrased in context of a developed economy, because a developing economy could not really implement meaningful supply side policies. A government is increasing the role of market forces in its economy. However, it imposed temporary maximum price controls. Let's see what maximum price controls are. They are essentially price ceilings. So if you have demand, supply, this is your initial equilibrium point. You have price at equilibrium. Let's suppose the maximum price will always be imposed below the equilibrium for it to be effective. Now this is the maximum price. It intersects the supply curve here. So this is your quantity supplied, which is what you'll actually trade. And this is your quantity demanded. Notice that suppliers are willing to supply less than before, if you look at it, because obviously the price is low, so they make less money. But people who are consumers are willing to buy more than before because the price is low, so they can get more goods for cheaper amounts. This is essentially a huge shortage that often maximum price maximum price controls lead to. So they've asked why a government might be committed to reducing who is committed to reducing central planning. So they're ideally trying to let the market flourish. But why would they surprisingly introduce price controls? They don't really like central planning. They want the market. But this is one exception to that, to increase allocative efficiency. And that's not true, because you've messed up the allocative efficiency of the market system. In fact, now you just have even more issues with allocation. You could draw the typical diagram and see how that's not marginal cost pricing as well. You don't increase the incentive for producers to raise supply. If anything, as we saw, you decrease the incentive and you reduce quantity supplied, simply because now the prices are low, so it's less incentive to produce. You don't reduce consumer demand either. Prices are low, you just increase consumer demand, shown in the diagram as well. You do this to reduce the expectations of inflation, because naturally now what you can see is prices have fallen. I want to caveat this. Inflation is a macroeconomic concept. I'm showing you a microeconomics diagram, but it works in terms of for descriptive purposes. So generally, if you do this across all products, like the price level should probably fall, or should be kept, at least for that industry, to that maximum price. So it helps keep the price low. So it reduces the expectations of inflation. The expectation of inflation is how much inflation you expect in the upcoming years. Right, that concludes our paper. Hopefully it was useful and all of that made sense. If there's any question that you feel did not make so much sense, or you feel it requires additional explanation, please do comment and let me know, and I can try to explain that in more detail.